Hello. I hope the audio is going to be okay on this. I'm going to make a quick disclaimer about that. Actually. I'm going to make a quick disclaimer about that, or not disclaimer, explanation, I should say. A number of people now have pointed out that the audio on this is not great. I apologize for that, because it must be a little bit frustrating when you're trying to watch and you can't hear everything. I have looked at my volumes, I've looked at everything, and I'm not really sure what I can do. The volume is actually built into the laptop, so I'm not sure I can't physically replace that. Um, I suppose I could get some sort of microphone or something like that, but in the meantime, I'm just going to try and speak directly into the speakers and try to be as clear as possible. If this problem persists, I'll try and invest in some sort of microphone or something to amend it because a few people have pointed this out. So anyway, in this video, I'm going to be talking about something that I feel quite strongly about, and that is the subject of crime. Um, Not any specific crime, just the subject in general, and specifically the penal system and all the issues around that. The context for me doing this is that I came across a reply to a post I'd made a while back on the Nordic justice system, which I am pretty critical of. The guy had taken my post out of context. Because I was critical of the system, he said, "Oh, do you want a brutal system and this sort of thing?" I was trying to make the point to this guy that, but incidentally, he's in favour of abolishing all prisons, which I think is, to me, that is just not only extreme, it's morally just wrong. Um, the idea of abolishing all prisons. I'll come to that in a minute, but um, when I say that I think, for example, the Nordic system is Um, I could say too soft, but I'll put it another way. It gets its priorities wrong. Um, then people will think, oh well, you must be in favor of the alternative, like brutal prisons with, beating regimes and this sort of thing. Absolutely not. Why does it have to be one or the other? Actually, what I advocate is something around the middle. Um, the truth is, you're never ever going to have an absolutely perfect prison system anywhere in the world. Looking around the world, I've spoken about the Nordic example. It's famous for being so, at least to outsiders, so lenient. But to compare that to other systems, the American system, obviously, it incarcerates a lot of people, incarcerates more people than the rest of the world. They generally have a very strict regime, even for minor offences. But looking at the American system, it hardly helps to lower crime rates because the United States still has very high crime and a lot of gangs form within prison. I mean, the sort of prison system that is in place in the United States is famous precisely for having organized gangs within them, the likes of San Quentin and so on. Some of those prisons pretty much are hellholes, so I don't think that is the right way either. Um, Then there is parts of the world, and this may be down to an economic factor, but parts of Southeast Asia have really cramped prisons. You have people in there for days without a lawyer, and then if they get medical conditions, they're not treated, and that's the same in some parts of Africa. I think in the case of developing countries, a big factor is the economic factor. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about will be in the context of a developed country, notably the UK, simply because I don't know enough about the situation in developing countries to be too critical. I don't like it. I don't think it's particularly humane, but I don't know enough about it. I'm sure. I'm sure those conditions are not just to be sadistic or something. I'm sure there's more to it than that, and I do believe it's an economic factor, and that's unfortunate. But I'm not going to talk at detail about that. So anyway, my conclusion with that little analysis is that there's no perfect penal system in the world. Now, here in the UK, people are often very vocal about criminals getting off the hook and our soft system and so on. If they think our system is soft, they need to check out Norway or Sweden. Those systems are truly I don't want to keep saying soft because that makes me sound like a sort of like I'm using tabloid-esque language, but I can't think of any other way to put it. Um, so I think compared to other parts of the world, our system is not that bad. Having said that, there is a lot of focus on prison itself. Um, the problem is when prison doesn't work, i.e., when criminals continue to recommit crimes when they come out and so on, that people start questioning prison itself. I think this is a mistake because I think the principle of prison is a just one. That is, that someone who poses a threat to society should be incarcerated. The utilitarian choice is to protect society. So for me, I've got no problem whatsoever with the principle of prison. The real question is not about abolishing prison. And by the way, I think people who have that position are either incredibly naive or they're extremists, quite frankly. I think if you advocate allowing dangerous people to just wander around doing what they want, and making them sign up to pledges and stuff is if they're suffering from, well, if they have a condition that is making them prone to violence, then you just can't take that risk. So I think people who advocate, and it isn't just about that, it's about the basic principle of fairness, and that's one of the main points I want to come to. But what I'd like to talk about as well is that prison itself is being questioned as a concept. I think that's wrong. Prison isn't the problem. How prison is run is the issue. Prison itself is not the problem, because if you have a well-run prison that serves a purpose other than just punishing the inmates, then that could be a very positive situation if it does prove to reduce reoffending rates. Um, so I, for example, don't believe in a system where it's just brutal, it's just punishment, and inmates are treated in a brutal way. I don't believe in that. If I was a prison governor, this is what I would do. First of all, I would have a zero tolerance to any sort of bullying, whether it be from other inmates or from guards. I'd have a complete zero tolerance to that. And I would make it clear from day one that any inmate or any guard engaged in that sort of bullying behaviour is absolutely out in their ass. If it, in the case of an inmate or a group of inmates, then I would immediately separate them from the victim and warn them that any, attacking the victim again will increase their sentence. I would instill that sort of regime because I think that each and every person there is serving their own sentence. Okay, it's the state that's punishing them, and it should not be other inmates that is taking matters into their own hands, whether it's for fun or whether it's some sense of vigilantism or whatever. Um, I don't believe in anarchy in the prison system, so I do think that high risk inmates, that is, people accused of very serious crimes or serving a sentence for very serious crimes, should be in their own unit. So I think paedophiles should be with paedophiles and so on. I don't believe in mixing paedophiles with armed robbers because they're two very different types of crime. And whilst I've no sympathy for paedophiles, if you have a situation where the armed robber decides to be a vigilante and kill the paedophile, then you're going to have anarchy in the system. And that's something that cannot be tolerated. Why? Because it breaks down the whole system. Um, and it negates the idea of taking away liberty from people because then it gives the inmates a right to just do what they want, and that's actually more inhumane than a rigid system, I would argue. Um, what else would I allow? I think that some form of education is necessary, especially regarding whatever crime they've committed. So I think educating them about now in many cases, and this is important to point out, they know full well that what they have done is wrong. So this isn't always the case that they don't know the difference between right and wrong. Indeed, they wouldn't be there in the first place. They would, in some cases, they'd be in a psychiatric hospital, or they would be, in the case of those who are underage, they would be treated as minors. But for free-thinking adults who do it simply because they're greedy or whatever, then I think the first priority in education should be, um, I would seriously consider drilling into them some sort of replicating the victim's point of view scenario. And I would actually instill that program into them, mandatory, no choice about it. Force them to undergo this program until they learn empathy. I think what is missing from criminals is empathy. 99% of criminals don't really give a damn about their victim. Okay, maybe it's a little less. There are some who express regret and so on, but most of them don't really care when they commit the crime. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it in the first place. Um, so I think a program of instilling empathy in those that are viable for that, i.e., those who still have a mental capacity and whose crime was motivated by greed or anger or whatever. I think there could be there needs to be studies done into that. I think that could be something that could be very useful. In terms of education, well, this is a double-edged sword because the fundamental question is why should inmates be given opportunities that people in the real world might not have? There's people in the real world who can't afford tertiary education. They wouldn't necessarily get the chance. There is an open university. But the point is, as soon as the public, especially in this country, start to think that inmates are getting everything that law-abiding citizens get, then that flushes justice down the drain. I know the Nordic system believes in giving them everything. Now, the guy that I was debating with said that, oh, but their freedom is taken away. Well, true, maybe their motions are taken away, so they're restricted as to where they can go within a certain limit, although they could still wander around the prison compound. They can wear their own clothes, that the rooms are completely decorated with anything they want. Um, there's people in the real world live like that. There's people in the real world have lives like that, maybe through a disability, maybe for one reason or not another. So the idea that that in itself is punishment, I don't agree with that. Some people might even choose that lifestyle. Some inmates might even prefer it. Um, so I think that any sort of education system within the prison system, in itself, it's a good idea. I think I'm not completely against the idea, but it needs to be focused on the right things. There needs to be something that brings the victim into that. So whether it be teaching them to learn empathy, whether it be teaching them that crime doesn't pay, whatever it is, there needs to be something that brings their crime into it. So I don't believe that they should just take courses in, I don't know, Greek classics and that's it. Um, because that's something that people in the outside world could do anyway. So I don't think that's, yes, if they get a degree, if they're focused on it, that's obviously a good thing if it helps them to stop reoffending. But there needs to be something that brings a victim into it. Um, I'm well aware that there's been programs whereby inmates themselves have been interviewed about what works, what doesn't. That's all very well, and I think that it definitely has some use. The problem is most of those who have served their time don't seem to really accept that they and they alone are to blame for that. They say, "Oh, punishing us won't change us," and this sort of thing, and they go along the lines of, um, basically having everything their way. My message to those who have done time, okay, you've done your time. I'm not going to, I'm not going to demonize you now. You've done your time. I accept that. But don't forget that you done your time because you made a choice. And to me, it's a bit like when um, people who get an addiction choose, and I'm getting into controversial territory here, but I staunchly believe in personal responsibility. Maybe that makes me sound like a Tory, but so be it. I do staunchly believe in possibility. I believe that people are responsible for the choices they make in life. And I get tired of social workers and people on the hard left and neoliberals and inmates themselves blaming everybody but themselves. So they blame society, they blame everybody but themselves. I am somewhat sympathetic to young offenders who maybe have abusive parents and that sort of thing. That's why I think there needs to be, if it comes down to a choice of a child being taken into care or staying with abusive parents, I think care is the lesser of two evils. It's not an ideal situation, but anyway, this is getting now into the territory of root causes, and I want to talk a bit about that, but there's so many issues to cover here. Root causes is vital. Of course, you cannot just have punish, punish, punish without tackling the root causes. Um, but at the same time, I think generally in society, we've negated some sense of civic responsibility. So, for example, one of the main reasons for crime in London, I often hear is, oh, well, there's nothing for young people to do. I'm sorry, but I find that very difficult to believe. In one of the world's biggest cities, if as a young person, I never got bored in this city. This city's 50 times smaller than London, so that to me is an excuse. And I do not believe in just giving people what they want. It's sort of like blackmail. Give us what we want, or we'll commit crime. No, I don't accept that. The second someone commits crime, they're immediately responsible for that action. If they are complaining there's not enough to do, if, for example, there's youth clubs closing down, that's obviously an issue and it needs to be addressed. But I don't believe that there's absolutely nothing that can be done. And this actually comes into a problem with attitude as well. So if you're a young person and that's the excuse you're making, um, basically two things. You need to be more open-minded. Put your mind to it. There's bound to be other things out there that you can think about without, other than just youth clubs. There's bowling alleys, there's cinemas. If you're being blocked from those places, then maybe you need to consider why. Maybe it's your mannerisms. Maybe, in the end of the day, what I'm saying here, and you won't agree with what I'm saying, you won't like what I'm saying, but stop acting as if the entire world is out to get you and start reflecting on your own actions. If you go around in a big gang, um, talking loudly and acting in a very brash manner, then you're going to make people intimidated and then you are going to have a problem getting into places. So take some responsibility. Um, so yeah, back to prison. I don't believe in a brutal regime, and I get annoyed with those who think that, oh, if you're opposed to this namby-pamby neoliberal model, then you must be the flog 'em and hang 'em brigade. You know what? It's possible to be. It is. Here's a point, and this will be very controversial, but it's very possible to respect the human rights of inmates whilst also punishing them and making them face consequences for what they have done. What do I mean by that? Well, what is human rights? It's a right to medical treatment. It's a right to be given a fair trial. It's a right to exercise. It's a right to food and nutrition. When it comes to inmates, I would say that is about the height of their human rights. And probably include one more, the right to reform themselves, give them opportunities to reform. But I don't count having a TV as a human right. I'm sorry, but I don't. Um, I would have a situation whereby they're given abundant exercise, whereby they're given an opportunity to do something useful rather than just languishing in their cell, but has to be useful, not just entertainment. Um, I mean, my goodness, this is what you would say to students. A teacher wouldn't just let their students watch a movie without it having some sort of educational purpose. Well, it's the same principle. I would give them decent food, that's edible. If they have religious requirements, I would observe that, and so on. Incidentally, about the religious thing, if they're a religious inmate, I'd give them access to uh, a multi-faith chapel, within reason. I wouldn't certainly not have a situation whereby they're making demands left, right, and centre that go beyond their basic religious requirements. Um, that's pretty much it. But I guess I'm making this video because I get really, really tired of people who seem to think that there should be no consequences whatsoever, and their entire mindset is on the poor criminal. When you see someone behind bars, this is a very important point. And when they look like they're really fed up and they're depressed and they're crying to themselves and all the rest of it, frankly, we have to harden ourselves a little and consider, well, what did they do? And then when you consider the crime, think about the victims. I know this sounds like a cliche. I know it sounds like the thing that every right-wing newspaper says, but I really think it's a valid point. In the end of the day, a free-thinking adult who makes a choice to commit crime has only themselves to blame. I don't want to see a brutal system, okay? So I don't want to see young inmates taking their own lives. I get nothing out of that. It brings me no pleasure. You know, it depresses me. I don't like to see that. But at the same time, I don't want to see smug, grinning inmates coming out and literally laughing at the system because, you know, they haven't learned anything from it. There are those who say that prison is a school, a university for crime. That absolutely should not be the case. Um, of course, there needs to be a huge focus on reoffending rates. Actually, I have to say, within this country, and I admit I've no sort of evidence to work on this. It's just my gut instinct. My instinct that is that violent crime has actually dropped in this country. I'm actually relatively optimistic about the situation. I actually believe that crime today is less than it was 10 years ago, in part because we're not hearing the same. I remember around the mid 2000s, late 2000s, there was a wide range of stories about sickening crimes taking place. We do get those occasionally, but I really think my core instinct is that something has gone in the right direction. So that's something to be welcomed. I've no hard evidence for that. I mean, the government figures show that overall crime has went down. It may be that some types of crime has gone up, but I will say this: you know, you cannot take emotions out of the picture. So saying to victims of crime, "Oh, you've no right to expect the criminals to be punished," that's perverse, quite frankly. And it's something that why I have no respect for the Nordic system, is it seems to completely ignore the victims. It seems to put the entire focus on the offender. Um, I also don't believe in political correctness in this regard. So there's a tendency now, for example, not to call young offenders young offenders. That's bullshit. If you offend, if you commit a crime, you are by definition an offender. Okay? I mean, this idea that we call them, oh, just young people who are committing crime. No, that's pandering to their demands. Um, I don't, I'm really skeptical of that. Um, my problem with the ultra soft approach, I have a problem with both the really hard approach and the really soft approach. First of all, the really hard approach, all it does is brutalize people and make them more angry. So I'm not in favor of that. But the really soft approach, i.e., giving criminals what they want and just basically not recognizing that they have responsibility and they need to face consequences, proportionate consequences for what they have done. The problem with that attitude is they don't actually learn anything from that anyway, because they're basically being taught, oh, I'm a victim of society. That's, to me, that makes just as wrong. I'm going to round this video up because I've spoken for a while now, but I don't have all the answers here. Okay, this is obviously something that needs a lot of studies and a lot of time and reflection. But one thing is for sure, we need a system that does not let down victims. Victims of crime must be put first. They must be. That just goes without saying. And too much of the debate about the system just overlooks victims. Um, and to those people who constantly talk about focusing on the criminals, I would say, well, just wait a second. You need to take into account, you need to recognize what they have done. And I sometimes lose patience with those who just can't see to bring themselves to recognize that this person has committed a serious crime. To them, it's all like, oh, society's giving them a rough ride. Let's feel sorry for them. No, just no. Some of us, you know, I still remember when I was 16 years old, living in an inner city area, I remember the fear and the stress that it caused me and my family being plagued by gangs. They would physically attack our house on numerous occasions. I got attacked several times physically. Um, I've never forgotten that because I can't forget something like that. I still remember the fear. So when you've been through an experience like that, then you'll most people have been through that. Of course, they want reoffending rates cut, and believe it or not, they don't just want the inmate to suffer. It's not like that, but they do want to that the person who's terrorized them in that way, who's put them through that situation, is facing tough consequences for what they have done. So to me, the Nordic system, I don't know how you can turn around to a woman who's been raped, or someone who's lost their home in an arson attack, or someone who's been paralyzed from a violent assault, how you can turn around to them and say, oh, well, yeah, the person who done this is inside, but you know what? They have all the things that you have. They're just not allowed to go beyond the compound. To me, that's perverse. So to any Scandinavians watching, I like everything else about your countries. I like the scenery, I like the high standards of living, all this sort of thing. But your penal system, I'm sorry, but as someone who's been a victim of crime, I cannot understand this. I cannot understand a system that puts criminals first. I just don't get that for a second. Um, and as for the American system, I'm not particularly in favor of that either. I think it's too almost militarized. And the point is, it clearly doesn't cut reoffending rates. But I do advocate something in the middle. Prison uniforms, I wouldn't be entirely opposed to that idea. Um, no doubt there's some EU legislation that would be against it, and this is an area that I'm quite against the EU on. I mean, there is some benefits in terms of cross-border getting criminals who flee borders. That can be a benefit, but I don't think that British crime policy should be dictated from Brussels. That's something I do take issue with. I also think the European Court of Human Rights has been abused on far too many occasions. There's been times where it's been very important, um, and it has, for example, cleared up situations that are nothing to do with the sort of crime that people are thinking of. It's more to do with um, all sorts of things. I mean, it covers a wide range of areas, but I also think that it's been abused. And I think it's perverse, for example, that a serial rapist can stay in the country because he has a right to a family life. I think that's disgraceful, and I think our government should have the power to deport someone like that without question. Um, make of this video what you will. You may not entirely agree with what I'm saying. All I ask is that you're objective. I've tried to be objective in this. Um, you'll probably gather from this I'm relatively conservative, not party conservative, but conservative in my thinking on crime. I just believe that when someone makes a choice to commit crime, they have to face consequences. That includes petty crime, so-called petty crime. There's very few crimes that are victimless. There's a few, but most have victims. And even petty crime, I would make sure that person is in a situation where they're forced to think twice about ever doing it again.